Exciting news here at One Idea Away. The book, Uncovering the Life of Your Dreams by IPEC founder, also my business partner, Bruce D. Schneider, is now available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Books A Million. It's an enlightening story of a character who finds himself asking some challenging questions. Is this all there is? What's the purpose of my life? He goes on a very unique journey to be able to uncover who he is at his core. You're going to hear about 5 portals, which are essentially pathways that help us to peel back the layers on who we think we are. Each of these pathways helps us experience life in a whole new light, becoming more centered, fulfilled, and at home with ourselves with every step. Gene Houston, the pioneer in human potential, says the novel evokes higher dreams of who and what we really are and what yet may be. Tal Ben-Shahar, well-reputed Bestselling author and famed former Harvard professor of happiness, shares Bruce Schneider has written a personal odyssey with universal implications and that it can guide you to more fulfillment and happiness. And Mary O'Malley, the famed teacher and author of What's in the Way is the Way, shares this: there is something deep inside of each of us, something inviting us out of our everyday world into the world that we long for. And Uncovering the Life of Your Dreams shares the process of remembering who we really are at our core. If you want to learn more about Bruce D. Schneider, you can actually check out the interview that we did with him very recently. So check that out right here on the podcast feed. And otherwise, be sure to get out there and pick up your copy of Uncovering the Life of Your Dreams today at any of the major online book retailers. And now, on to our show. Hi there, and welcome to One Idea Away, not just a podcast, but a community and ongoing conversation meant to inspire and empower individuals to live more fully, deeply, and consciously. Let's jump into today's episode right now. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to One Idea Away. You know, you can learn so much about someone, about what brings them happiness, about what creates stress, about how they may even try to control life and what their values are, all with one conversation. A conversation about how they view money. That's right, money. It's been called the root of all evil, and yet at the same time, it's supposedly our ticket to happiness and freedom. It can cause any number of stresses in our lives, whether we're trying to earn more or just keep more of what it is we already have. And money reflects something so much deeper. It reflects our inner beliefs and what we really truly value, not just what we think or want to value. You know, it's interesting. Over the last few years, studies have shown that money only increases our happiness up to a certain amount, and a very specific amount, $75,000 a year in income. After that, there's really very little change in someone's happiness levels as related to money, regardless of how much more you may make. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of us that would have no trouble trying to test that theory out and see how it goes. But before we get there, let's get some money mentorship so that we can have a more complete picture of a richer life. One that extends well beyond just the dollar signs. Today, I get the chance and the honor to welcome Dr. David Krueger. He's the CEO of MentorPath, an executive coaching, training, and wellness firm. He's the author of 20 books, and it's his book, The Secret Language of Money by McGraw-Hill, which is a business bestseller translated into 10 languages. That's our focus for today. He's also the founder and director of 2 licensed specialty certified trainings, one of which is the new Money Story Mentor Training. So you can get a sense of who we've reached out to for this chat today. With that, Dave, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on One Idea Away.
Thanks, Luke. It's my privilege.
Dave, I'm curious, from just kind of a little bit of a background or a backstory standpoint, what is it that led you to investigate and dive into the mindset, the story, the language side of money?
Well, that's a great question. I practiced 25 years as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and I heard a lot of money stories from my patients, a lot of professionals, executives, and the first time I was really focused on this, I was asked to participate in a panel on professional fees, on meanings of money to professionals. And of course I said yes and thought, well, I'll read all the available literature, and there wasn't any. There was one book that was written by a psychoanalyst something like 20 years ago. So I recognize that it's something we don't talk about. So I edited a book called The Last Taboo, which is that we don't talk about money, and professionals who traffic with it every day with many, many patients had not talked about it or really discussed it, and that has continued to be the case in some ways. So it became of interest to me to see why there is such a difficulty in dealing with some issues around money, because it's such a common thing that we do every day.
Yeah. What do you think it is? What's within our kind of our association towards and relationship with money that seems to affect so much of our contemporary lives?
Well, money can solve many problems, or at least make them easier. Mm-hmm. In fact, someone once told me, I've never seen a problem that money's made worse, maybe with the exception of drug or alcohol addiction. Mm-hmm. He has a point. But then we overreach. We try to make money solve more than it should. We press it into service because it's such a commonly accepted social and personal resource. And we also compare our inside to somebody else's outside and think money can bridge the difference. So we give money meaning. We give it emotional value. We build a relationship with it. We make it bigger than it is. And we even use money to regulate moods or adjust self-esteem, even influence others. So we try to soothe emotional pain with it, because money can make any statement and carry any message. It's like a Rorschach. We project our story, especially about money, onto money, and that makes it larger than it really is.
It's amazing to see, because having seen this myself with just my own conversations and clients and things like that, it really is amazing how much meaning and story we put into money and the many, many different ways that we use it to carry out that story. Maybe we can actually start on that side of the conversation of, you use that term, that phrase of a money story. So maybe you could clarify a bit about what is a money story, and let's go from there.
Well, a money story is not what you think about in terms of how you rise to riches or battle with bills. It's not about debt or cash flow or any of the fluctuations of bank account or investment. Your money story is what you consciously tell yourself and what you unconsciously tell yourself. It's how you organize the meaning of money. For example, it's what you unconsciously tell yourself about who you are, what money means to you, what money says about you. And it's a kind of running dialogue about how much you feel you deserve, how much you feel you're worth, how much you're even capable of. So it's also about what would happen if we had more, or what would happen if we lost it all. Let me give you a simple example of some just very simple research I did. When the first book I did many years ago came out, I had done a number of presentations to executives, to professionals, and I would pass out an index card and assure them that I would treat it anonymously. And I would ask 3 questions. What is your current income? What income would you need to feel secure, confident, no problems about money? And the third is, write 1 word of what money means to you. So there's the whole smorgasbord of what money means to them. Worth, love, control, power, freedom, a number of things. The interesting thing is that when they wrote down what their current income is, what they believed it would take for them to be happy and carefree about money was roughly double. So for somebody who made $100,000, they thought it would take $200,000. And with follow-up, there was a trailing double. So the people who thought it would take $200,000, when they got to $200,000, they thought it would take $400,000. Same with $500,000, they thought it would take $1 million. Same with 25 to think it would take 50,000 to be happy. So this really brought into focus what is enough, what more is. To have a goal of more is to not really have a goal. It's kind of like saying, I want to be perfect. you never reach it. So there's never contentment, there's never the satisfaction and the effectiveness, so you keep pushing it out. And this is what I saw in terms of analytic patients, way back. I made a transition entirely a dozen years ago to do executive mentor coaching. But when I saw originally analytic patients, they had bargained with themselves to think, well, when I get to 5 million, then I'll be really happy, or some number. And those who were honest with themselves, and they said, well, I know I've kept it going and I've kept the hope alive, but more money is not the answer. So when they had that self-reflection, I began to see them to look at what else it was. What was money a stand-in for? What did it represent? And what did they really want and need in terms of their own self-development?
That's really interesting and specific, because there's a few different avenues we can go in. So let me start with this one. That idea of pushing it out further, the everybody seemed to have this doubling effect of, well, if I only made twice what I make now, I'm going to feel more secure. I'm just kind of curious, when we do that, when we continually push it out, when we make it mean something more, what's the effect of that? Kind of what impact does that end up having on our lives and our decision making?
Well, let's begin in the simplest way first. It has a direct impact in our brain. Whenever we have a hope of something, that hope triggers dopamine, the pleasure chemical. So when we keep hope alive, we keep the indication that we can get where we want to be, but we also keep the stimulation alive. It's very analogous to somebody who spends. The anticipation of purchase is what triggers dopamine, so that's stimulating in itself. And then to sustain that, they need to keep purchasing. It's not the purchase, it's not the acquisition, because that ends the process. What we know now, as a good example, in terms of it's the anticipation of something that we keep our focus and keep doing it. When people are hooked up to an fMRI machine, a scan of the brain, a video of the brain, when they approach a slot machine, there's a hit of dopamine, the pleasure chemical, before they ever touch the slot machine. So it's the anticipation that does it. And that's when people experience, for example, on the other side of that, buyer's remorse or disappointment that the long anticipated purchase of something really exciting has not lived into what they expected, and certainly doesn't enter the same zone as the anticipation, because it's a whole different neurochemical system. That it's the marathon system, not the sprint system. So, and think about what are the things that keep any story engaging a reader or a listener. It's wanting to know what happens next. Does it trigger dopamine? And that's what determines a bestseller from a non-seller. Anything you read from anything you put down very quickly, you want to know what happens next. So the successful stories have that. It's just that we have to be aware of and create a different kind of plan for our money stories.
I want to go to that side, but I'm gonna have everybody hold on just a little bit, because I want to make sure we fully understand what's going on here. That's a really interesting insight, though, in terms of that anticipation, that dopamine that is part of what's going on in the background here. I guess I'm curious, where does this begin? Meaning it's almost like we've got to learn a little bit. We've got to condition that type of pattern, that behavior early on in our lives. So I'm curious, what are the roots of our money story that we may need to be aware of?
Well, it begins very early in the models that we see in our parents of what money means to them, what they say with money, what they think money says about them, how they use money, how they regard people who have more or less. And money is the longest running relationship in our lives. Our parents discussed it before we arrived, and long after we're gone, people are going to talk about money. And despite the longevity of money in our lives, we don't really look more closely into how we understand our money story, and then how we can revise it. So much of this operates at a level that we only become aware in some way if it doesn't work. For example, we know now from neuroscientists that 90 to 95% of our operating system is unconscious. So that means most of what we do and how we go through our day, there are patterns that are attachment patterns, behavioral patterns, emotional patterns, meaning of money, for example, the things we say to ourselves about money that are not even conscious. So here's a specific example. What this means is that when 5 to 10% of our operating system is conscious, we have a surface story. And that story may be, I want to generate more income and create wealth. Now, if that surface story is countered by a shadow story that goes in the opposite direction, then we're going to be stuck, because that shadow story can be, well, I don't think I really have what it takes, or people who have a lot of money are really lonely, or it's not spiritual, or what if I give it all and then I fail? I'd really be embarrassed. I don't know if I want to put all of that into it and take all that time away from myself and my family. So when we get to the point of taking that step into generating a plan, if we have it, then that's when that shadow story can activate, or we activate our shadow story, and then we stop ourselves, because it's about avoiding pain at that point. And those are the two basic motivations we have, to seek pleasure or to avoid pain. And avoiding pain is more powerful. So if we see anything, even the process itself of change, and we're wired, our brain is wired to avoid change, then it's going to be a challenge. So this is where it takes some awareness and some strategy, and often collaboration, to really create a revised or especially a new story. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm curious how it is that we begin to surface that shadow story. So how do we begin to become more aware so that we can understand this shadow story, so that we can begin to work at that level?
Okay, here's the acronym, the deconstruction of understanding a money story. And this is what I do in training new money story mentors, coaches or financial, or just people who want to know more about their money story. And this is about how do we understand the algorithms of our brain in order to create a different kind of system. So there are 7 steps. It's the acronym is the roadmap. First is to recognize that we are creating the story instead of it just happens, or that's just the way things are. And then to own that story, to really take ownership and know that it's not there until we create it. Whatever we think and feel and experience is what we create each moment, even though it seems to just happen. And then to assess what works and what doesn't work. And to decide then what to change or what to do differently. So those are the first 4 steps. And then to map the changes, to specifically plan what to do next. And the next step is to author those, to create them, to put them in an output channel, to really do the things that we've strategically planned. And the last step, and this is crucial, to program new identity, because the most powerful force in the human psyche is for us to return to our identity. And that also means our default mode. So if we create a change and we don't really transform the model of how and who we are, we're going to revert back to our core identity, to our default model. And that means the change will ultimately vanish. So this is the part of the revision and the transformation that makes change permanent. So this is how knowing how the mind and brain actually work can be significantly helpful, because so many of the changes that we introduce or institute to create change are contrary to how the mind and the brain work. So it's not going to be effective. So these are the steps, and I have a whole number of exercises and work tools to really crystallize the awareness of it. But this is an overview, and in my view, the most effective system to really understand that. So that's why it's a good question, because this is the how-to. It's simpler to talk about, although I've never been accused of simplicity, but it's harder to do it because it's a process.
Well, I'm glad that there's two things. One, just kind of want to point this out to everybody, is I'm glad that you took it, that at that end we returned to this idea of programming new identity because of exactly what you said. This is such an incredibly powerful force within who we are, and money certainly is one of those areas, one of those issues that seems to be so wrapped up into our self-concept, our self-image, the identity that we have not only of ourselves, but of how other people know us, and what that can mean to our lifestyle, and all these types of things that can get wrapped up. But it does get wrapped up at that identity. But the most important aspect of that is what's underneath it. What are those steps? What are those discovery points? What needs to come before you actually can condition that new identity? Because that's how you know that you're getting down to the root, the cause of what's really going on. If we begin a little bit at that, recognizing that we're creating the story, what popped into my head, and this is where I'd love for you to elaborate on it, is that when we can start to become aware even of some of the conditioned behaviors or patterns that we have. You used the example before of spending, right? So that maybe we're using spending money on that next thing because we get that little bit of dopamine hit. Maybe that provides us a nice distraction, or it's a way of regulating our mood so we feel a little bit better for a period of time. How is it that we can begin to recognize more of those patterns so that we can begin to elicit the story that we're actually creating?
Well, that's a great question, and it doesn't have a simple answer.
Sure.
But the first step is self-reflection, of really looking at what's working and what's not, rather than continuing to inhabit the story that we want to believe, because it's difficult to change. The idea of change counters the way our mind and brains work. We have an automatic, anytime we do something repeatedly, like drive the same way to work each day, our brain rewires to make that automatic. So after about a month or so, we don't have to think about it. We can listen to an audio book. So to change means not only are we doing something that we're not sure it's going to work, and our mind software says, be careful. Our brain also, we have to leave the superhighway of the familiar to take a machete to uncharted territories and trails to create something different. And there's an actual part of our brain called the error detection mechanism that says this isn't right. This isn't what we expect. So that's why it takes a plan. And the first question I'll ask somebody when they've talked about an attempt at change is, do they have a plan, and what do they do to bring that about? So if they don't have a plan, that's the first step. If they have a plan and stop themselves short, then I'll ask, for example, what's the conversation in your mind the instant before you say no? So we're listening together then. All of this is collaborative. We're listening together to see, do they bargain with themselves to say, well, I'm going to start next Tuesday? Or they defy their own authority to say, heck with it, I'm going to do what I want to do? Or do they get scattered and are anxious and not know what the specific next step is? Then to look in a little bit, take a couple of steps back to look at this whole pain or pleasure thing, to look at what's the pleasure here, and that may be the plan, but there's some pain that they associate, as the examples I gave before, with proceeding that is enough to stop them. So a simple couple of questions here is, what's the greater pain if you don't proceed with your plans, and what's the greater pleasure if you do? So, a related aspect, and let me be maybe a little bit more specific here about your question. Since spending makes people feel good, at least in the short run, how do you get the same good feeling, or even better, through saving?
Yeah.
And it's hard to say because of the way our minds and brains work. The immediate pleasure of buying activates that pleasure center. So here are some possibilities that can counter those tendencies of being short-sighted in our decision-making. One is neuroeconomist Ben Seymour at University College of London has shown that imagining a future purpose has the same effect in the brain as getting it. Saving is easier when it's for something specific that we can envision. A vacation, a car, something specific. It's easier and more specific to create a distinct vision for each goal. Another way of thinking about it is tangibly calculate the cost of debt so that it becomes real figures. Because whenever you create debt, you pay for it 3 times. First, the error detection mechanism in your brain is, you can't afford that, but you're buying it. Then you have to pay the interest on the debt because it costs more money, and then you ultimately have to pay the debt. So also, on the positive side, is to concretely represent the magic of compound interest. Figure out what money you'd spend if you spend $100. What would it be worth in 5 years, in 10 years, at retirement, especially in a tax-protected retirement fund? And another is sometimes you only need to make a good decision one time. An example of that is you automatically deduct retirement savings from your checking account and set it up to do it the first of each month for X number of dollars. And that happens automatically. You've only made one. You don't have to revisit the decision every month and yes or no or what else am I going to do. You made a good decision one time. That becomes automatic.
It's interesting. Well, what you're describing is that there's certain elements of that plan that you can begin to put in place that makes it so much, steers you towards an easier path that is long run going to be a lot better for you from that money standpoint. And I like what you said before, which is just something I wanted to get a little further into, is that when you're not following through on that plan or something is the resistance is building or whatever it is, I think what you were also revealing is the inner conversation that we start having with ourselves around why we want to spend this or buy this or do that or what have you. And bringing awareness to that inner conversation really can help us understand what are the real blocks, what's the real hesitancy that's going on.
Absolutely, yes.
And so that to me is something that's really revealing. I love the connection to ways that we can begin to use that dopamine, fix, the desire that works for spending can also work for savings if we do this in a couple of different ways. It's funny, I got kind of this image of gamifying a savings account, right? Where we're keeping points based on how it's accumulating, and that's a positive way to look at it.
Yeah.
So
whatever works.
Whatever
it's going to vary individually.
Absolutely.
And this is the key for couples, for example. Money may be wired to mean one thing to one partner and something else. If money is wired to mean freedom to one partner and to the other partner, the brain wiring is security. Then you got a saver and a spender, so you have to create a common ground to create a collaborative way of moving forward. Let me reduce this down to a very simple way of thinking about it and give you, let me give your listeners a quiz. And then I'll point to a very simple way that applies here that can apply to each money decision. Ben Fletcher did a study at the University of Hertfordshire in the UK about making choices. He asked each participant, a large number of people, to choose between one of two very different polarities of behavior and to act accordingly for an entire day. It would be, talking about business, talking about sports, introvert, extrovert, two different opposite things, and a whole number of them. Additionally, twice a week, he asked them to eat something they had never eaten before, and twice a week to read something they had never read before. So after 4 months, of doing this, 5 days a week, what do you think the biggest change in that group was? The answer is the group lost an average of 11 pounds. Now, this baffled them initially because it had nothing to do with diet. There was only a little food component as part of it. But what he found is that this entire process and all the components made people aware of their choices. It focused on the choice architecture of how they made decisions throughout the day. And especially as it related to food, which is something they did concretely each day, they were aware of choosing whether to eat or something. Ultimately, most of them got to the point of looking at each bite they took. And they then asked the question, is this bite in my best interest? So that's how they got to the point of losing an average of 11 pounds. And follow-up for the entire remainder of the year, almost everyone kept off that weight and continued to lose weight, because this was a study in retrospect of choice architecture, making someone consciously aware of a decision about what's in my best interest. And that's one way to think about all we ever have to do in life is the next right thing. And sometimes we may not know what the next right thing is, but we can almost always know what it isn't.
Number one, that's an absolutely fascinating study. And I think when we begin to boil it down to what is in my best interest as we become more aware of the way in which we make these choices, I'll go back to something, a way that you had framed something before, and I forget the exact way that you framed it, but that when we look at our best interest, and we look at not just our best interest in this exact second or moment, but we also look at where this is going to lead. Maybe it was the idea of saving for a specific vision. When we look forward and we look at things of in the future, and then can ask ourselves, what is our best interest? How will we feel about this at the end of a day, the end of a week, the end of a year, the end of a decade? It begins to put this grander perspective around the way in which we make these decisions, which makes putting that decision of best interest almost that little tiny bit easier because of the context it puts it in. So that's a fascinating study, and it brings up so much. I guess just before we close, one of the things that I did want to come, kind of full circle on was that the kind of the second part of the sub-headline of your book is that this is with the intent to live a richer life. And I was wondering what your definition of a richer life was.
Well, richer is fundamentally not just about money or even about money. Now, it takes a certain amount, as you mentioned in the introduction, to be satisfied, but effectiveness and satisfaction comes with having ideals and living up to them. And that's the only place that I know that self-esteem comes from, is to have our own ideals, our own values, and live up to them. And that's where satisfaction and the sense of richness and contribution comes in. So it's simple, but yet it's immensely complex because it involves so much of really knowing and living into our own needs and our own ideals, and then looking at what may be a greater purpose that we have to live, love, contribute, and play with absolute passion.
Absolutely. Dave, I want to thank you very much for everything that you've shared on One Idea Way, and for a very enlightening conversation on something we all touch every single day.
Thanks, Luke. It's a total pleasure and privilege to do this with you.
Thank you. For everybody, again, Dr. David Krueger's book is The Secret Language of Money. I do, encourage you to check that out. And I think, in reflecting just on this total bigger conversation that we're having here, is the awareness that we bring to all the different aspects of our lives, the awareness of our patterns, the reflection of our choices. It's something that allows us to move past that surface level. It's something that allows us to move past that default mode, that routine mode that we all too often are run by and we exist on. And it allows us to start to look deeper. What is it that we really value? What is it that we really want? Who is it that we really truly want to be? And how can we shape our lives through all of our decisions, including those around money, to bring that
Luke, may I
experience of
mention
life
one
out?
more resource? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Another resource for some additional articles and especially a blog around the psychology and neuroscience of money is on my website, mentorpath.com, mentorpath.com. And you'll see access to the resources with the tabs at top.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Dave. And we'll be sure to include that also in the show notes for everyone as well. And so with that in mind, everybody, I want to thank you once again for dropping in. And until our next time together, continue to enjoy the journey. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you really enjoyed it, do me a favor, let us know. You can keep the conversation going and send us a message on our Facebook page, which is simply One Idea Away. Go ahead and tag me in the post or even just direct messages. Also, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this episode along with someone that you believe could benefit from hearing the ideas and the messages that we got into. That's pretty much why we do this. So you can just go ahead and share it from your app or email it along, whatever works for you. The point is to share, to talk, to discuss, and keep the dialogue going, because it's in those conversations that ideas can take hold and create profound shifts in perspective. That's what allows us to live life more fully, deeply, and consciously. As always, we would love to see you post a review for the podcast in iTunes or whichever app you're using. And until next time, remember, you're never more than one idea away from a whole new reality. This is Luke Iorio and One Idea Away, signing off.